coming out today. A friend recently asked me the following question. If Hamas launches a rocket from a densely populated neighborhood and CNN isn't there to see it, did it really happen? CNN would have you believe that no, it did not. And this is the situation that we're facing, and this is why we're here today. I am not so naive and delusional to believe that the executives who sit inside this building are listening to our words and becoming convinced to change their ways. I believe that the publishers, producers, reporters, and executives who work for mainstream media organizations like the New York Times, BBC, and CNN, and who rapidly call themselves journalists, could care less about what we are saying here today. They are political activists with an anti-Israel agenda that permeates their reporting. And their bias is not an accident due to the fact that Hamas has put a gag order on the news that comes out of Gaza, or because Hamas threatens reporters with breaking news. We now know that Hamas is quite successfully controlling the propaganda that is otherwise known as reporting on the war. So much for Jews controlling the media. But Hamas's control over the reporters on site in Gaza has nothing to do with the executives inside this building or the quote-unquote journalists reporting from Israel. Hamas has done nothing to prevent CNN and the other mainstream news outlets from getting the narrative straight. They have made a conscious decision to demonize Israel, to print faux pictures of dead Palestinians and bombed out civilian and UN buildings, and stories of a lack of water and electricity, all produced by Pallywood, with the support of these organizations that eat up the top terrorist propaganda with abandon. The mainstream media is complicit in creating an immoral, false narrative that harms Israel and its survival as low information citizens across the globe, many of whom have anti-Semitic tendencies to begin with, consume and disseminate these dangerous lies. And it's not difficult to determine the truth about Hamas's use of civilians as human shields. UNRWA as a supporter of jihadist activities, tunnels constructed for kidnapping and murdering innocents, and the mainstream media as dupes in the propaganda war. The internet has altered the face of journalism as YouTube videos, tweets, and blogs quickly help disseminate the truth. The IDF has learned with each war that it is not just fighting Hamas on the battlefield in Gaza, it is fighting it on the world stage of public opinion. During Operation Protective Edge, the IDF disseminated videos illustrating its soldiers knocking on roofs, fire the building, bombing the building, soldiers distributing flyers and making phone calls warning civilians to leave the area, and then abandoning strikes when they refuse. The interior tunnels that hold the implements of war and kidnapping, including missiles, arms, IDF soldiers, handcuffs and drugs to harm Israeli civilians. All to no avail, as the mainstream media prefer to publicize video clips of bloody Palestinian children without explaining that Hamas intentionally put them in harm's way. Of course, sometimes they pretend to provide both sides of the story. CNN's Jake Tapper had a clip on the veracity of civilian death numbers featuring Ben Shapiro of Truth Revolt and the always dishonest Peter Feinmark duking it out. Boo! Boo! Tapper opened the segment stating, "One thing seems clear, more Palestinian children have been killed than Israeli soldiers. How dare he?" This is simply appalling, and Tapper is one of the least offensive reporters CNN has. Tapper didn't mention that his information was based on UN reports, but he failed to disclose, he did mention it was based on UN reports, but he failed to disclose that Hamas provides the UN with their numbers. Where was the report of why the children were killed, the ages of the children? Were they 16-year-old militants? The location of their demise, were they hidden in a UN school that's also housing rockets? I recently watched a video clip of the IDF searching a home in Gaza. As they enter the bathroom and open the cabinet below the sink, it looks perfectly normal, like our sinks, and underneath in our cabinets. But then they remove the cleaning and other items stored inside. They lift up the cover and they lift up the floor, and voila, there's a tunnel in a civilian home underneath the bathroom. Did you see that on CNN?
No!
And I am not sure how many of you have visited Palestinian Media Watch's website, but video clips abound of Hamas and Fatah representatives promising to annihilate the Jews, promising a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, and calling for death to Israel. Did you see that on CNN or read that in the New York Times?
No!
What about the Hamas combat manual that the IDF just captured and that instructs on the use of human shields? Have you seen mainstream media, news outlets, condemn Hamas for its actions rather than bending over backwards to justify its war crimes?
No!
What about the video and articles about life in Sidra and the poor people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder due to survival based on 15 seconds to get to a bomb shelter? You haven't learned about that from the mainstream media. Did you learn about Hamas building a city underground using hundreds of tons of cement that could have built homes, mosques, schools, medical clinics, not to mention bomb shelters to protect their own civilian population? Each tunnel cost $3 million. There were over 30 of them. That's over $90 million. And there were 160 Palestinian children killed. Did you hear about that in the mainstream media? Have you seen pictures of the Palestinian children wearing faux suicide vests, holding Uzis, learning to kill before they can know how to read? You don't learn about that on CNN. Some journalists upon leaving Gaza actually do report the truth about Hamas's use of human shields. An Italian journalist tweeted, "Out of Gaza, far from Hamas retaliation, misfired rocket killed children yesterday in Shaba." And a journalist from NDTV upon leaving Gaza distributed a video clip of jihadists assembling and firing a rocket from a densely populated area next to a hotel. This has recently gone viral, and BB even called a special news conference to show this to international journalists. From CNN, we only get excuses for their failure to report on Hamas firing rockets in populated areas, claiming they were not given an invitation to the rocket launches. They didn't have a hotel room next to rocket sites. Too bad the NDTV video lived through that canard. Journalism is a dead profession. Izzy Lemberg, the former senior producer of CNN's Jerusalem Bureau for over 20 years, penned a column today in which she stated, "Journalists became vehicles for the Palestinian narrative of injustice rather than simply impartial observers of a complex conflict. In the current war, international media coverage makes it appear to viewers as if every morning Israelis wake up and ask ourselves, how many Palestinian children shall we kill today?" And I'd like to take this one step further. One of the reasons why I am here, why I'm not here in the hopes of changing CNN's reporting, but rather in the hopes of furthering the message far and wide that CNN is not a reliable news outlet, is because I believe the bias is based on anti-Semitism. As pro-Hamas demonstrations across the globe are rife with calls for death to the Jews, death to Israel, there is no distinguishing anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. And when mainstream news outlets further the message that Israel is killing innocent Palestinian civilians, taking disproportionate military action to defend its civilian population, and isn't facing existential threats by jihadists on its borders, one can only conclude that these organizations are just as much a threat to the survival of the Jewish state of Israel as the terrorists themselves. For without truth, anti-Semitism will continue to flourish. Attacks on Jews the world over will continue to escalate, and Israel's ability to survive will become ever more precarious. That is why I am here today. CNN, the New York Times, and other outlets who fuel the fire of anti-Israel venom are instead inciting violence against Jews. They're reporting only of the Palestinian perspective of victimhood, rather than the truth about Israel and its citizens under siege by terrorists. Is one of the reasons that we see such hatred on streets, not only across Europe, but across America as well. Pro-Hamas protests from Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, Philadelphia are being encouraged, perhaps not not openly, but certainly with inflammatory rhetoric and misinformation by anti-Semites posing as reporters.
Oh, you are famous! Cheers!
Until this stops, the numbers of Israel haters and anti-Semites will continue to grow. That is why I am here today. I am speaking to you as a representative of the Endowment for Middle East Truth, a think tank unapologetically pro-Israel and pro-America that fights daily to bring truth to our politicians and our citizens. Without truth, the entire Western world is doomed, for once Israel goes, so too will the rest of the civilized world. This is a war against global jihadists who are not just looking to destroy Israel, but all civilization. The media are not telling you the truth about the war that Israel is fighting, or the war that we all must fight. And coming here today makes us all soldiers on the battlefield in search of truth, which is the first step in winning. Thank you all for coming and continue to fight.